Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I am delighted to talk again to Dr. David Solomon Jalajel. You are most welcome, sir.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Dr. David Jalajel is a researcher with the Prince Sultan Research Institute at King Saud University in Saudi Arabia. He holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of the Western Cape. Formerly, he was a lecturer in Islamic theology and legal theory at the Dar al-Ulum in Cape Town, South Africa, where he graduated and then received the higher specialization in Islamic law and the higher specialization in Arabic. David will be speaking today about a controversial but important question. Did Islamic beliefs hold Muslims back from science? So it's a really important question. David, would you like to introduce us to this fascinating subject?
Yes, thank you very much. What spurred me to discuss this topic is reading Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. It's not the major topic of his book, but one thing that is part of his clearly fascinating and well-written introduction is a history of science and religion in Christian Europe and the different phases it went through. And that spurred me to respond to that issue with respect to Islamic theological positions and how it grounds or did ground science. I found of particular interest his discussion of the conditions under which science began to flourish and rapidly develop in Christian Europe. He explains that the key to that was escaping from the metaphysical assumptions of Aristotelian philosophy, particularly its notion of logos and the idea that the logical structure of the natural world provided a necessary order that could be determined chiefly through rational reflection. He describes this as them making an overestimation of pure reason. They were too confident in what reason could tell you. And so they thought reason could tell them about the world and about God's relationship to it. They didn't have to explore further. He contrasted that with a return to creation ex nihilo. God creates everything from nothing. And a completely volitional God, or a God with absolute free will, who does what he pleases. And so when they returned to that in his narrative and left at the Aristotelian ideas, they saw the universe as being contingent on God's will, being not necessary, but everything is just possible. Whatever we see is something possible for God. And so because it's contingent on God's will, they'd have to explore it. And Myers described this as the recovery of the doctrine of creation. He calls it the recovery of the doctrine of creation. He says, with that, science began to take off in Christian Europe. According to this narrative, science was freed through emphasizing the contingency of creation. Contingency is possibility, that things don't have to be the way they are. God could have made it other than the way it was. He didn't have to make the universe the way it was. Myers quotes where Robert Boyle said, "It is not the job of the natural philosopher to deduce what God must have done, but instead to go and look and see what he did do."
So can I just clarify, when Robert Boyle, who by the way was English, but natural philosophers were what we would call scientists. This is just the word science is a 19th century word, but before that, in the 16th century, the 17th century, what we would call scientists were called natural philosophers. So just that expression is just an archaic way of saying someone who is a scientist.
Yes. So you see that is a very interesting quote from Robert Boyle. He said, it's not our job to look at what God must have done, like an Aristotelian, according to them, would have done, to use reason and deduction to determine what had to be the case, but to look at the world and see what God actually did do.
Right.
And now Myers continues. He says, this break with Greek thought meant a shift to a contingent order from a necessary order. And this was the primary factor that led to the acceleration of scientific enterprise in the West. This was signaled in the year 1277 when Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, writing with the support of Pope John Paul XXI, condemned necessitarian theology. and 219 separate theses introduced by Greek philosophy about what God could or could not do. This was further spurred on by the Protestant Reformation. These factors opened up a more empirical approach to science, a look and see approach. You want to learn something? Look at it and see what's going on. A historian of science, Ian Barbour, explains, and I quote, "The doctrine of creation implies that the details of nature can be known only by observing them." That is what he said. And this was coupled with a belief that nature was intelligible because it was created by the rational mind of God. Therefore, human reason, as created by a rational mind of God, still had a vital role to play in ascertaining the truth. But that role was to be employed in empirical engagements with God's created world, with a look and see exploration of the world. Myers also identified the belief in the fallibility of human reason, as people were subject to self-deception, flights of fancy, and prematurely jumping to conclusions. So that required verification of the things that we study and learn about. So he identifies all of these elements, as well as what he describes as a decentralization of religious authority brought on by the Protestant Reformation as an additional factor. If you have an actual singular central authority, it would be very easy to police thought. When that authority is dissipated and fragmented, then people can do things with a little bit more freedom of thought. Now, that is basically, after reading that, it struck me very deeply that these are precisely the conditions that prevailed in the Muslim world throughout most of its history. Necessitarian doctrines of a Greek theological bent had repeatedly been encountered and repeatedly rejected by mainstream Islamic theology. The prevailing orthodoxy has always been committed to a completely volitional God, a God of free will, the God fa'alu lima yurid, the one who does what he pleases. The completely volitional God and a completely contingent world order, which comes with a completely volitional God, a God who can do whatever he wants. It means the world is only possible, and it doesn't have to be the way it is. There's no necessity that the world has to be of a certain order and not of another order.
Yeah.
So this was mainstream Sunni Islamic theology throughout the history of Islamic theology. The same Sunni orthodoxy rejected the notion of clerical authority. There's no priest class in Sunni Islam. There's no priestly hierarchy. And even politically, the Muslim world maintained a highly decentralized form of government in its classical period. Even during the time of the caliphates, there was a lot of decentralized authority. Local rulers in the regional areas would have their own madrasas and schools and run with greater autonomy. In later centuries, that even became more localized government. So that was the case. And religious authority was also very decentralized. Therefore, all the factors, every factor that Myers describes were very much in evidence in the Muslim world. All the factors.
Right.
The first being the doctrine of God's complete volition. Again, God is fa'alu lima yurid, the doer of what he pleases. The second is a doctrine of the world's complete contingency. Nothing has to be the way it is. Nothing has to be the way it is. So that means you have to just know what happened in the world. If scripture is not telling you something that happened in the world, the only way you can learn about it is to look and see what actually is out there. 3, the doctrine that the world is no more than the manifestation of God's action. And since God's actions are free, they can only be known from scriptural revelation or through empirical observation, and no other way. And we've talked about the seen and the unseen. Things like heaven and hell, they're creations of God, but they're not part of the natural world that we see. We believe in the one faith. Other things, we see them, and we know that they're there. But we cannot know about what God has done in his creation except through scripture and through empirical observation. The fourth element is the doctrine that God's actions in nature are wise and intelligible to human reason. And this means that we can understand God's created order. It's not totally erratic. It's something that we can engage with and understand. The obligation of engaging with reason for faith in this way was stressed not only by the ascendant Kalam traditions of the Asharites and the Maturidites, but also by the Taymiyyah Salafism. Ibn Taymiyyah stressed the role of reason in knowing God and declared that sound reason and revelation can never be in conflict. He actually wrote a famous book called Rejecting the Conflict Between Reason and Revelation. That's the name of the book.
Which I'm reading at the moment, by the way. But a different subject.
Yeah. Yes, it's a very stimulating subject. He also famously emphasized the role of natural causes and natural processes, which I've discussed in an earlier presentation. Ibn Taymiyyah's emphasis on natural causality. All Sunni theologians also stressed, this is a fifth element, that reason has its limits. Importantly, humans can never encompass God's wisdom. We are prone to project our own limitations on God in ascertaining what could be wise for him. That is a great error. This means that we cannot presuppose what events and phenomena take place in the world because that is what we expect God to do. We cannot have our own expectations of what God should do and project them on the world. We actually have to look and see what happened in the world. And finally, as I mentioned, a highly decentralized religious authority, which led to a decentralized control of religious knowledge, was typical of Muslim society throughout most of its history. So this describes the Muslim world.
Right.
And I would say it's even stronger, these elements are even stronger in the Muslim world than the way Meyer described them in Christian Europe at the time that they overthrew necessitarianism. Indeed, the man most vilified by the modern imagination as an enemy of science in some popular discourse today was instrumental in defending the principles above. And he lived at a time of highly decentralized political and religious authority. This man was Imam al-Ghazali. And often he is used by some people, there's a narrative going around that because of his triumph over the Greek philosophers, in his book Tahafut al-Falasifa, or The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he put an end to rational inquiry and put an end to the flowering of science. It's totally wrong because it doesn't even match up with historical events that were going on at the time. But this is not just for Ghazali, it could be said for other Asharite and Maturidite theologians who lived before his time, as well as his contemporaries and his successors, like al-Bazdawi, al-Razi, al-Amidi, and al-Nasafi. You could say this about all of them. These elements were clearly, strongly the case for all of them. Moreover, al-Ghazali himself warned that it is wrong for theologians to condemn scientific findings about the world, and that doing so is counterproductive. He says that himself twice in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, his book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. He says, we reject a lot of the philosophers' metaphysics and their theological positions on God, but we don't want to get involved in the scientific and mathematical arguments. That's not going to help us by trying to defeat scientific or mathematical claims. And they use the eclipse, for instance, that you can't say, when people see that they can predict the eclipse, if you say that, well, this is against Islam, you're going to make people doubt religion, not doubt science. So that's Ghazali himself. It's not surprising that many of the great scientists in Islam, like the optician Ibn al-Haytham and the polymath Abu Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmed al-Biruni, are generally understood to have been on the mainstream Sunni creed. This means that the same factors that Western historians of science identify as the factors for the flowering of science in the late medieval and post-medieval West were strongly in evidence within the mainstream Sunni Muslim orthodoxy from before that time, and moreover have stayed that way for the majority of Muslims up to the present day. So I found it fascinating reading Meyer's account of the role that church endorsement of necessitarianism and later repudiation of Aristotelian rationalism is seen to have played in the history of scientific advancement in Europe. I found that fascinating that when they said that the Aristotelian thoughts was more predominant, it held back science. And when it was overthrown and returned to a volitional God and a contingent universe, science accelerated. This is interesting to me because there's a narrative today in the Muslim world, a very common popular narrative, that the triumph of Sunni orthodoxy over Greek rational philosophy is the reason why Muslims supposedly ultimately lag behind Europe in the sciences. They blame the ascendancy of Asharism particularly, and its doctrine of God's free will, and the doctrine of the world's contingency, and the repudiation of philosophical rational necessitarianism as the reason for this decline. Pervez Hoodboy is one of these people that advocate this idea, and he's a good example of this. He particularly vilifies Al-Ghazali, and particularly vilifies his Incoherence of the Philosophers, which was a decisive work in repudiating much of the Greek-inspired necessitarian metaphysics. So it is really fascinating to see that scholars of the history of science in Europe, like Ian Barbour, Thomas F. Torrance, and Peter F. Hodgson, are presenting the opposite narrative, that Aristotelianism held Europe back from scientific progress, and a return to a volitional, free-willed God, a contingent universe within a doctrine of creation, is what led to a flowering of science in Christian Europe. It is particularly interesting to me, since I have long maintained, speaking from a purely theological background, not a historical background, that Sunni theology, with its volitional God and radically contingent world, is amicable to science and not hostile at all, and that the rival necessitarian philosophical traditions pose more challenges and problems to the acceptance of science in the Muslim world.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. But how do you explain then the decline of science in the Muslim world in contrast to what Dr. Stephen Myers refers to as the durability of science that he sees in the Christian West?
Good question. This is a highly debated historical question, even as to the existence and the extent of that decline and what factors might explain it. Now, I am not a historian, so I can only talk from a theological angle. And from a theological angle, what can be said with certainty is that the theological elements Western historians have now identified as crucial for the development of science in the Christian West were certainly most strongly present and dominant in the Muslim world throughout its history.
Okay. Now, Dr. Stephen Myers, in his book, stresses how science in Christianity was used to strengthen faith, especially with the design and the teleological arguments. Was this the case for Muslims?
To some extent. However, for Muslims, the argument from contingency itself became the paramount argument to prove the existence of God. And that followed from an argument of the occurrence of the world. And that was the contingency argument became ultimately the strongest argument. This argument of contingency is to show that the universe does not have to be the way it is. It does not have to exist at all. It therefore needs God to determine that it exists and to determine it to be the way it is. Arguments from looking at the design in nature and in the teleology or the purposiveness of many things found in nature, like how the eye is for seeing, and things that show design with purposiveness. They're definitely strongly evident in Muslim arguments for God, but they serve a supporting role to the primary argument of contingency.
Right.
And the main function of such arguments for Muslims was to reveal aspects of God's nature and his attributes, like his wisdom, his mercy, and his perfection. So design arguments in particular were less crucial for Muslims in establishing God's existence itself. And they may have been more important for that purpose in Christian Europe.
Okay. Now, in Dr. Stephen Meyer's book, there we have it, and I interviewed him just a week ago. He notes in his book that the historian and philosopher Stephen Fuller of the University of Warwick here in Britain argued that the necessitarian thinking that prevailed in Europe in the Middle Ages owed, quote, less to Aristotle or Greek science generally, and more to the influence of Islamic scholarship on the interpretation of Aristotle and his works, came into currency in the Christian West during the 12th and 13th centuries, end quote. If this is the case, how can it be said that the Muslims had the critical elements you described in their own thinking?
That's interesting. And what Fuller said may very well be the case in Europe. However, even though peripatetic philosophy or Greek classical philosophy saw a development in the Muslim world, for sure, through philosophers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, who were known respectively in the West as Al-Farabius, Avicenna, and Averroes. Their views of those philosophers did not dominate in Orthodox Muslim theology, particularly for Sunni Muslims. That is especially the case for their necessitarian doctrines, which were strongly opposed by Muslim theologians. On the other hand, these same philosophers, particularly Ibn Rushd or Averroes, were very influential in Europe.
Yeah.
Averroes himself was the strongest advocate of Aristotelianism among the Muslim philosophers. He was a champion of Aristotle among the Muslim philosophers. And he had only a modest influence on the Muslim world. By contrast, in Europe, he was famous for his extensive commentaries on Aristotle. And a whole school of philosophy in Europe, known as Latin Averroism, developed around his teachings. It was actually this philosophical tendency that seems to have been the primary target of the 1277 condemnation from the Catholic Church that Meyer refers to. So it's yes, those philosophers may have been from the Muslim world, but their impact seems to have been stronger in Europe.
And that's very interesting, getting that perspective. So in the Muslim world, these Muslim philosophers like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, as they're known in Arabic, their influence was much more marginal in the Muslim world. And obviously, there was sustained attack from people like Al-Ghazali in his Incoherence of the Philosophers, and by Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, most famously, a little later on, and others. So that these weren't the major mainstream figures at all, that they were in the West much more and had a much bigger impact. So sitting here in the West, we have a slightly distorted impression. We think that what was the case here must have been the case much more so perhaps in the Muslim world, but that wasn't so. The great titans of Islamic orthodoxy, the Sunni orthodoxy, as you say, Al-Ghazali particularly, but also Ibn Taymiyyah and others, were very, very critical of the necessitarian implications of Greek metaphysics that had been infused into the thought of Ibn Sina, for example, Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd, where so the creation somehow necessarily emanated from God, and God didn't exercise his will to create in the way the Quran obviously does say he did, freely, without any constraint or interior compulsion to create the universe. So in a sense, the Quran there was correcting the misunderstandings from Islamic point of view that these philosophers had in importing Greek metaphysics into Islamic philosophy. So that's very interesting.
It's not to say that the philosophers like Ibn Sina particularly didn't have an influence on Muslim thinking. It did. But it's particularly the necessitarian doctrines and other metaphysical doctrines were rejected by mainstream orthodoxy. They were not adopted. And Ibn Rushd, particularly, his impact was extremely strong in the West and was very minor, unlike Ibn Sina in the East. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we still await the deliberations of historians, and understand you're a theologian, of course, rather than a historian, to clarify perhaps the historical processes involved, not just the intellectual and theological and philosophical factors involved in the differences between the West and the Islamic world, and whether or not there were issues to do with any other issues that retarded allegedly scientific development in the Muslim world or not. I mean, I think if you learn anything from these subjects, we need to look again at the historical evidence very carefully, rather than just go with received ideas about what must have been the case because some scholar said so 50 years ago in a book issued in Britain or something. We need to look again carefully at the evidence. So it would be fascinating to hear in the future from people a more objective account than heretofore perhaps we have been given in Britain or America or in Europe anyway.
I would love to see that, actually, especially taking into account the theological issues I brought up when they engage with this. That would be very interesting to me.
No, I think it's a very healthy corrective. I thank you very much for that, David. The mainstream Muslim Sunni world was not enthralled to some kind of ideology that retarded, held back, or even denied the contingency of the universe and the necessity, in the sense that we must go and look and see, as you put it, to find out what God has actually done. And I'm glad that has been clarified by you, because it's a very, really important point. So if there is an issue, if there is a problem with the Muslim world not advancing scientifically in the way that it might have done, we know at least it's not to do with Islam. It's not to do with Sunni orthodoxy. It's not to do with mainstream Islamic thought. If there is an issue, historians have yet to tell us, perhaps, then we need to look elsewhere if there are issues. But it's not to do with Islam. Islam remains free of that accusation, indeed, provided the intellectual context or crucible by which people could go out and did go out and to investigate the world that God has made contingently. So I think it's a really important point, actually, you're making.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present it.
Great. Well, we'll leave it there because this is a pause here for further discussion with historians who can perhaps shed more light on what actually happened, if there was a problem, and if there was, what were the causes, the historical causes, the cultural, whatever it was, maybe to do with colonialism, maybe to do with geopolitics, maybe to do with who knows. But there could be a variety of factors involved in the difference between the Western European experience and the Muslim experience in the Muslim world. So thank you very much indeed, David, for your expertise and your time as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
Till next time.